Hey there, and welcome to the Elijah Rising podcast, where we discuss the myths, misconceptions, and most asked questions about sex trafficking. And today, I am so honored because I'm joined by Desirie Dougall, the director of the Elijah Rising Restoration Campus. Desirie joined the Elijah Rising team in June of 2019, but she is certainly not new to the anti-trafficking space in this work, or trauma-informed care for that matter. Mm-hmm. So first of all, welcome, Desirie.
Thank you.
So happy to have you on the podcast. We've been looking forward to getting Desirie on the podcast since we launched it. So instead of me telling people what you bring to the table, tell us a little bit about yourself and the experience you bring.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Definitely not new to this field.
Yeah.
I've been working in the anti-trafficking community here in Houston for just over 10 years now. So before coming to Elijah Rising, I worked for another organization here in Houston called Redeemed Ministries, which has the longest running residential program in the Houston area and one of the longest running in the country. So I spent time there doing all kinds of stuff, educating the community, doing outreach in Houston area brothels, and then helping them launch their street outreach and running that for several years. I became operations director there in 2015, so went into doing things like case management and leading groups in the residence. And at the same time, I also made just a ridiculous decision to go back to school. And so get a master's that focused on vulnerable and exploited populations. My previous education had all been in business, so I had a marketing degree and an MBA, but I really felt like I needed more in-depth ministry training for this kind of work. So just both between schooling and Redeemed, I got to study with just experts in the field of trauma, in psychology, in neurobiology, and just how all of these things affect, long-term exploitation.
Right.
And so this last year at Elijah Rising has been awesome. It's been a great opportunity to create a safe space for women who are coming out of exploitation with our program.
Yeah. So you've kind of done it all. I mean, because, you didn't mention, you also kind of ran the social enterprise over there a little bit. And I mean, you've really...
I launched that as well and ran that for a couple of years.
And we're so thankful for Redeemed Ministries. They have been in Houston forever. And when I first got into this work, they were one of the first organizations that I found out about. And this episode of the podcast isn't specifically about our restorative care program, but we've really learned a lot from Redeemed.
Absolutely.
And you coming from them has helped us a lot to build out our own restorative care program at Elijah Rising. So shout out to Redeemed Ministries. We love you guys.
Yes.
So on today's episode of the podcast, we want to talk about trauma.
Yes.
And so that's why you're here. This is your field of research. It's your field of expertise. You live trauma care on a daily basis through our program. But first, before we dive into all of that, why don't we just lay a foundation? So first question on today's podcast, where we really want to answer the larger question of what causes trauma. Before we get there, why don't you tell us what is trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a word that gets used a lot, especially in the work that we do. And so to just really define that.
Yeah, it is kind of a buzzword these days, isn't it?
It is, and so it gets used a lot. But if we look at just the basic definition, it's a Greek word. It means wound, which is pretty accurate. But that really just refers to the physical sense. We all know what trauma means as far as a traumatic injury, but we understand trauma now as being much more than its physical effects. The American Psychological Association defines trauma now as an emotional response to a terrible event.
Yeah, which that brings up, one of the things we want to do with this podcast is talk about myths and misconceptions.
Yes.
And so, one of the myths around trauma is trauma can only be experienced as a result of some life-threatening event. So is that true?
It's not. The event, whatever this terrible event that one goes through, it doesn't have to necessarily be life-threatening. All of us are experiencing trauma, quite honestly, right now.
Yeah.
As we go through this global pandemic.
Right.
It's something that is causing stress, it's causing anxiety, it's causing fear, and it's causing a shift in our everyday life.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
It's causing a massive shift for a lot of people, and that's traumatizing.
That can be traumatic, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that kind of already leads into, the the show title, What Causes Trauma. You're kind of going there already. So outside of like a global pandemic, which is what we find ourselves in, outside of, something like being sex trafficked or something like that. So if such a large population is experiencing trauma, what is it that causes trauma other than that, singular life-threatening event?
Sure, absolutely. So now that we know, kind of trauma can be caused by more than just life-threatening.
Right.
We can talk a little bit about something called ACEs.
The ACEs score.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
So this is something that's kind of a standard in the field of trauma and psychology. It stands for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It was conducted over several years in the late 90s on children and adults who had gone through different experiences in their childhood and how that affected them later in life as adults.
So things that happened in their kind of childhood development process.
Yes, yeah. And what kind of experiences and what kind of effects those experiences had on them, and their health, their behaviors once they became adults. So there's a ton of information on that if you want to look it up. The CDC has that on their websites if you're really into research data.
If you want to nerd out on
but
ACEs.
Yes, which I do. But but that's the overall premise of the study. So just looking at the questions on the assessment, and I'll go through some of those.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. What are some of those?
So if you lived with somebody who had depression, mental illness, or suicidality, that's traumatizing. If you lived with anybody who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, if you ever had the feeling that you didn't have enough in your life, like were deprived of food, didn't have clean clothes, had nobody to protect you, or if you lived with somebody who had addiction to street drugs or prescriptions, somebody who lived with somebody who served time in prison.
Oh yeah.
Were your parents separated or divorced? That's traumatic.
And that's a large segment of the population, right?
That's huge. How often did, parents abuse one another or you? Before 18, did you ever have any kind of physical abuse happen to you? And that doesn't necessarily include spanking, but it can, certainly. Any kind of emotional abuse like swearing, insulting, being put down, by your parent who's supposed to be a loving influence on you. Did anybody older than you, like, an adult or even an older teen in your house, sexually abuse you in any way?
Of course, yeah.
Or somebody that wasn't in your house do that, whether it was a family member or not. And did you ever, have any feeling that your family didn't love you?
Yeah.
So feeling neglected in some way. So, this list has evolved over time. They have added other questions to some of these things as other research is done. The death of somebody close to you in your life, witnessing some kind of horrific accident can be impactful. Being bullied is something that came about in years, recent years, that has been added to the list because it can be very detrimental to a child. So there's just a number of things that can traumatize especially children, and impact them later in life. Yeah. But, as we look through that list,
so what is,
people.
Because we're a trauma-informed organization here at Elijah Rising, we our staff understands the ACEs score, and most of us, I think, have taken it, right?
Absolutely.
So I know my score, and it was really interesting going through that process of answering that long list of questions. Like, I wouldn't have associated some of these things with trauma. I said a second ago, like, it's a buzzword. It's been thrown around a lot. When I started this work in anti-trafficking work, we understood trauma, but not to the scale that we do 10 years later.
No.
Right? And so I'm wondering, so the way that the assessment works, you kind of mentioned it, right? You answer these questions and you actually give numbers and you end up with a score.
Yes.
And what happens, like, the higher the score, what is the result of that?
The more vulnerable somebody is to all kinds of things.
Yeah.
They're more vulnerable to addiction, more vulnerable to mental health issues, more vulnerable to being preyed upon, like in trafficking.
Yeah.
Just more vulnerable to health issues. This isn't something that just affects people on a mental or emotional level. It's something that affects people's physical health as well.
Sure, yeah.
So there are a number of things that you become more vulnerable to the higher your ACEs score is.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to my next question too. So I think a lot of times when we talk about trauma, some just assume that that's a physical thing, like a physical trauma.
Absolutely.
But the conversation we're having is talking a lot about mental, emotional, including physical, right? So what's the difference there? What's the difference between those types of trauma?
Absolutely. So like we just talked about with the ACEs and COVID-19 and stuff, these are definitely emotional traumas. They cause us to be fearful, anxious. We can lose control of thoughts and emotions. Emotional toll, like I said, just it can take a whole toll on our physical health.
Sure.
When it goes untreated, certainly. And so we have to be very aware that it's not something we can just expect people to get over.
Yeah, you can't just muscle through it.
No, you can't just power through it and be okay. We can't tell people like, just, think positively, pray your way through it.
Yeah, be happier.
Yes, be happier.
Or whatever, yeah.
Any of those kind of things. But just like that Greek original word means wound, there's definitely physical trauma. Traumatic injury is one that is severe and requires immediate medical attention. And these kind of things obviously happen all the time.
Right.
They happen in, car accidents, at work, at home. It's what we call 911 for, for the most part. And, we also hear about things like traumatic brain injury, which is definitely a thing. And it can exhibit a lot of the same symptoms as emotional trauma.
Oh, interesting.
So you'll see sometimes, things like seizures, dizziness, migraines, fatigue, but it also can cause a lot of emotional dysregulation as well.
Right.
Like that distress and anxiety and stuff. Traumatic brain injury, or TBI, as it's a lot of times known, really came to prominence in the last few years as they started seeing it in military returning who had PTSD, but it was also a deeper issue of brain injury. And then also in the NFL, years back, as they started realizing that these repetitive concussions and things like that were not just,
a short-term cognitive issue.
No, these were causing lasting effects.
Yeah, long-term issues,
and traumatic brain injury. Yeah. And it's also it's not uncommon for us to see that in the women that we serve as well, as just a result of abuse through in what they've gone through. Yeah,
PTSD is another, I guess it's not a word, it's an acronym, but it's a buzzword of sorts, right?
Sure.
PTSD. And we really started hearing about that, at least at a larger societal level, at least in my experience, like during the Iraq War, right?
Yes.
And so we start hearing about soldiers and they're suffering from PTSD and the response to that. And it's very real. And so I think we have this idea that trauma is PTSD is associated with
yes,
an IED on the side of the road exploding right in a Humvee or something like that. Just for example. So PTSD though stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's something else to consider, right? Something now that we're talking about is complex PTSD.
Absolutely.
So what is the difference between those two things?
So post-traumatic stress disorder, absolutely. The phrase kind of became coined after, I want to say the Vietnam War.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it started being recognized that, soldiers were coming back with these mental symptoms, that they weren't recovering from quickly. And so it is a lot of times, though, that either singular or one or two, these traumatic things that have been witnessed or gone through, that symptoms persist for more than 30 days and forward.
Oh, okay.
So it's very real. It's something that doesn't just happen to military, though. We see it a lot of times in police officers and firefighters and all kinds of emergency personnel, medical personnel, but also in just normal people who've been through a really major car accident or had, witnessed somebody experience a violent death or just any kind of severe life-altering event.
Yeah.
And it's just, they struggle to get past the psychological distress and the anxiety and the fear.
Yeah.
It just continues to
Yeah.
stay in their life.
Would you say that women who are being prostituted, women who are experiencing sex trafficking, are they experiencing complex PTSD?
Yes, they are to experience what's called complex PTSD, not just the PTSD that we just talked about.
Right.
PTSD is something that certainly happens after like a rape.
Right. Okay.
They've had a woman has had like a horrific trauma, and she might experience PTSD after that. But when we get into what these women who have been trafficked or undergone long-term abuse of some kind, domestic violence victims, things like that, we get into what's called complex PTSD or complex trauma.
Okay. Yeah, because it's happening repeatedly.
Yes.
Repeatedly.
So that complex trauma is that when we have those horrible events happen to us over and over and over and over again.
Right.
And so it's not something that, it's something that develops over a long extended period of time.
Right.
And it can happen through things like neglect, abuse, or like we said with the trafficking. So the difference is that single event versus long-term exposure to whatever this trauma is.
Right.
And the treatment and recovery for PTSD versus complex PTSD are very different, and they have very different timelines.
Yeah, and so we're going to do our next episode of the podcast. We're going to talk about trauma-informed care, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So just hang with us on the podcast. We're going to come right back around to what Desirie just mentioned there. So, yeah, I mean, that's really the life of many individuals who are being trafficked, right? I mean, many women who are being prostituted are experiencing something like a rape on, maybe 7 times a day, right? For years, potentially. And so we're seeing complex PTSD, over and over again. Okay, well, we're going to take a break in the podcast now, but we're going to come right back. Hang with us. We're going to come back and continue this conversation with Desirie. And we're going to talk a little bit more about who has trauma. We've already been kind of talking about that, but we're also going to talk about how someone can know if they've experienced trauma. So we'll be right back.
Hey everybody, I hope you are enjoying today's episode of the Elijah Rising podcast. Right now I'm standing in the Elijah Rising store that sells goods that empower survivors of sex trafficking. All the items in this shop, the purchases support the employment as well as the restoration of women that are in our program. So please come visit us at 11th and Studewood or online at shop.elijahrising.org. And today on your first purchase, we're going to offer you $10 off if you shop online using code podcast.
Welcome back to the Elijah Rising podcast. Again, I'm joined by Desirie, the director of our restoration program here at Elijah Rising, and we're talking about what causes trauma. One of our goals with the podcast is just to answer these myths and misconceptions and most frequently asked questions around sex trafficking. And trauma definitely is one of these issues that's right in the middle of this trafficking situation and ending it and responding to it, right? So one of the myths and misconceptions about trauma is only weak or overly sensitive people experience trauma.
Yeah.
So you're the expert here today. Is that true?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Why not?
Absolutely not. So we talked about a little bit before the break, that everybody experiences trauma.
Right.
You know, most all of us have trauma of some kind, but, we talked about, military men and women, experiencing trauma, emergency personnel, police officers, people like that, are some of the strongest people out there.
Yeah,
they're
well
doing
said.
some of the hardest work that can be done,
Sure.
responding to critical situations every day. And they can be traumatized by what happens. Doctors, psychologists, people, every day. It doesn't matter how sensitive or tough you think somebody is. Anybody can be traumatized, by something horrific.
And you just make me think, we're in the midst of this global pandemic with COVID-19, and it really has reshaped society. And when we look at who the strongest among us are right now in the middle of this thing, who would we say? I mean, it's our medical professionals who are on the front lines, who are literally putting their lives at risk every single day. Would anyone say that they're just being overly sensitive or weak?
Exactly.
And they're certainly experiencing trauma, right? They're watching their patients die in front of them, and all these other...
They're isolated from their families.
Yeah, right.
It's absolutely... Those are not weak people.
They're not weak people, right? Yeah,
Not at all.
Is just the product of a fallen, broken world that we live in. So I want to ask a question. Who experiences trauma? We've kind of already answered that. It's basically everybody at varying degrees, of course. So let's maybe talk about, is trauma just an individual, isolated thing? Is there such a thing as a communal trauma? Could we experience trauma together?
Absolutely. Yes, trauma is something we can experience on an individual level, but there is definitely communal trauma, community trauma, like what's going on right now with the global pandemic.
Sure.
But just thinking in my own lifetime, 9/11.
Yeah, that's a good example. Right.
The entire United States was traumatized. By what happened in that time, and people struggled. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people struggled with that for months and some even years, with the images, with, the fear of a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. And we're incapacitated by that.
Sure.
Even if they weren't directly on site, it was something that was very real in our lifetimes, and it's not the only time something like that's happened. This is just a more, recent reference.
That's such a good example, Desirie, because when you bring up 9/11,
I have goosebumps right now just thinking about it because I remember it so vividly.
I start seeing the images in my head.
Yeah.
And specifically, and hopefully this isn't too heavy, but specifically the first image that popped into my head when you mentioned 9/11 was the picture of the people jumping out of the building.
The towers.
Because jumping out was better than the fire.
What was happening,
And it's this response where it's like, I remember exactly where I was the moment that I found out.
100%.
When I first saw those images, I feel the way I felt in that moment. Are those indicators of a trauma?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
That is now, 19 years past.
Yeah.
But it affected us. It affected everybody in this country, and even people outside of this country.
Right.
It was such a dramatic and terrifying thing.
Yeah.
That absolutely, we can be traumatized as a country as a community. Cities, riots happening in a city, or things like that. We aren't necessarily always experiencing our trauma as an individual. It can absolutely be a community event.
A collective experience, yeah. So to that point, I'm just describing my own trauma. How can someone know if they have experienced trauma, are experiencing trauma? How can someone identify that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we were just describing, feelings that we're having. We can... If we're having feelings of constantly reliving, those images just going back and forth over and over again in our minds, is definitely an indicator that we are struggling with whatever this is. If we are replaying an event over and over in our minds, or a fear outcome over and over in our minds, that's certainly a symptom that we could be being traumatized.
Like a fear that's going to happen again?
Yes, this impending doom scenario playing out over and over in our minds, or the replay of whatever the trauma was.
Right.
These things, having flashbacks to the event, or dreams, that relive the event. We could have trouble sleeping, disruptions in sleep, worry, constant worry and anxiety. We might isolate to avoid re-experiencing anything that could remind us of whatever it is. And that can look like a lot of things.
Sure.
Not just holding up in a room. It could be isolating by diving into, TV or something like that just completely shuts out, any outside indicators. So a lot of these kind of things can be indicators that we might be experiencing trauma, or if we see somebody else going through these things, they might be having a traumatic reaction.
Yeah. So I'm going to use another buzzword here. We're talking about triggers.
Yes.
Right. So what we use that word all the time.
Yeah.
What is a trigger?
So a trigger is a legitimate thing, and I know it is something that gets overused again, like you said, a buzzword, but we do encounter things that can bring out a strong reaction in us that can trigger a feeling or an impending, doom type of situation, or that can take us to a flashback or a moment, where we begin again reliving that experience.
Yeah.
So triggers are very real.
And do we see, I know the answer to this question, but do we see this in individuals who have been sex trafficked?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what would be an example? Obviously, we're not going to disclose any, thing, but what would be an example of someone who has exited the life, that may be in a program like ours? What would this look like? That trauma, that trigger, how might they respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. A woman who's triggered could do any number of things. She might completely shut down. And just dissociate. She might just go blank.
Yeah.
And start in her mind. We can see that she's kind of, so to speak, left the building. And in her head, she is spinning through whatever the circumstance was. She might have a panic attack, or some kind of hysterical episode of some kind. They look any number of ways, but it is very real.
Yeah. So we've established a lot in a short time on this podcast, right? We've talked, your childhood development and experience, some things that are totally out of your control can result in trauma.
Absolutely.
You can experience an event, you can witness an event, you can be a part of an event, individually or collectively, right? That can cause trauma. Some experience varying degrees of trauma, all the way to complex PTSD, such as victims of trafficking who are experiencing a trauma repeatedly.
Yeah.
So, and we've talked a little bit about symptoms and triggers. I guess we should really ask the question then: what should someone do when they recognize that they have experienced trauma or they're currently experiencing trauma? When should we seek help? I guess is what I'm asking. When should we seek help?
If we realize that we are in some kind of severe emotional distress, if we know that there's something that's happened, there's something that's going on that we are really having a struggle with, and it's not getting better.
Yeah.
A few days is going by and it's not something that's getting, that's decreasing in intensity, and it's just not going away.
Yeah.
Then we may be really facing an issue of trauma.
Yeah.
And we want to reach out as quickly as possible so that we don't get to a point where we feel like hurting ourselves, or get to a point where we might hurt somebody else.
Right.
Especially right now where we're all quarantined, we're all struggling right now in an isolated state. So we definitely want to reach out. And I know that's difficult right now.
So we're kind of drawn to an end of the podcast here. So maybe, do you have any resources that we could mention or share with the listeners?
Absolutely. There are both phone and internet resources available right now, since we're not
Right. In
leaving our
person.
homes.
Yeah, right.
But there are some great hotlines. The ones that I'm going to mention right now are all 24/7, 365, and they are operating right now.
Great.
So there's SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have a 24-hour hotline that is still up and running.
Awesome.
And they are available and have trauma response. So the National Suicide Prevention Health Line is also currently running. There is a crisis response line specifically for kids and teenagers.
Oh, great.
Which is great. You just text CONNECT.
To 741-741.
Absolutely. And I haven't listed the other phone numbers just because I know we're going to put them up.
Yeah, we'll put all of these websites, phone numbers in
Yes.
the the notes. So in case you're wondering, like, hey, give me the number, you can find that in
Yes.
the details. But keep going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's also the National Hope Line Network that also is 24/7. There are a ton of other resources online as well, numbers that you can look up that are available, say, Monday through Friday, business hours, things like that. I wanted to offer ones that are available 24/7.
Yeah,
just
that's great.
off the top. There's also online counseling going on right now, which is great, so people aren't losing access to their mental health
Right.
resources. But these are specifically websites that do all online counseling. So Talkspace.com, BetterHelp.com, and TeenCounseling.com all offer online counseling, and tons others again, but a lot of these also offer sliding scale payment rates so that they can be affordable. Absolutely lots of resources out there to reach out to.
And if you're listening and you've heard something here, you think that maybe I'm experiencing trauma, maybe it's time to seek help. We encourage you to use those resources, and you're always welcome to reach out to us, email us. We can also offer other resources, or if you have questions, we can help with that too. As I mentioned earlier in the show, and if you follow the work of Elijah Rising, we do operate a restorative care campus as part of our work to end sex trafficking. And Desirie here, you're the director of that program, which is, it's more than a program, really. We're talking about individual, real human beings who have experienced complex trauma. And as a result of their sexual exploitation. I think sometimes we talk about these programs and we talk about the movement to end sex trafficking, which is all great.
Yeah.
But we're talking about individual, real human lives who have gone through this and are still working out their journey of healing.
Absolutely.
So I want to take the end of the podcast here to just give you an opportunity to tell us what's going on at the Elijah Rising Restoration Campus in these unprecedented social distancing pandemic days. If you wouldn't mind, just give us an update. What's going on out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like everybody else, we are under self-quarantine.
Yeah.
We actually started that probably about a week earlier than a lot of places, simply because, the women we serve don't always have the best immune systems.
Sure.
Physical healing is part of our holistic care program, but not everybody has had the opportunity to, have all of their medical appointments and things like that. Everybody's in different stages.
Sure.
So we kind of pulled back on public a little early.
Yeah.
But so everybody is at home, and both staff and residents. So we have a revised rotation schedule for staff, just to kind of help with what's going on at the campus with everybody stuck at home. It's obviously affected how our groups and classes are able to go on, things like that, just because obviously we can't have outside people in,
Right.
and we're not able to take them to a lot of the places that they would normally go. Everybody being home all the time, our utility bills are up.
Yeah, that's right.
Our grocery bills are up because stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
Everybody's bored.
Yeah.
There's a lot of boredom. We're doing our best to come up with activities, but they're bored, and trauma and boredom don't really go well together. There's a lot of time to be in their heads, and that's not really a happy place most of the time.
Yeah.
We've postponed medical appointments, like I said, so there's going to be a lot of rescheduling that's backed up, once all this is over. So, and there's with additional staff comes, with the bulked up staff comes, overtime and things like that. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah. So, we are an essential service during this time. And as I said, this is more than just a program. It's actual human beings that have needs. And in case you're not familiar with our restoration program, it's offered at no cost to the women who live in the residence. We cover all of their needs. And we do that through partners and donors, giving and partnering with the work that we're doing. And so if hopefully this conversation about trauma has been really informative and helpful to you or someone you might know. Hopefully you've learned something. But we also just want to take this opportunity to invite you into the work that we're doing and partnering with us to continue to provide a safe, stable, long-term restorative care environment for women who've survived exploitation, sex trafficking, and trauma. Complex trauma. And so if you feel moved to do that, we just invite you to partner with us and donate today. You can do that on our website at ElijahRising.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. And there's something else that we do that's a part of the program. Sometimes we don't always clearly connect the program and the social enterprise, but they are connected, right? The social enterprise provides job opportunities, job training skills, all sorts of things. And so if you want to shop the store, it is closed physically right now, but it's open online. And you can find that shop.ElijahRising.org, and you can help support us that way as well. Otherwise, subscribe to the podcast, rate it, go on YouTube. If you're listening to us right now, there is a video version of this podcast available on YouTube. We invite you to check us out there. For any other information, feel free to reach out to us. You can find all of our contact info on the website and in the show notes. With that said, have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Elijah Rising podcast.